Yeah, it looks like most people are back in here. We just had a great question that spurred me to think of something I want to mention. We are recording all of the speeches. It'll take us a little while to get them with some text on them, get them split up, and get them put out on YouTube. But they'll all be out there at some point. So if you're trying to capture things with your phone, feel free. But don't go ahead and take your notes and try to gather more of the content, because this will all be available, and you'll be able to get all this. Everything in context eventually once we get it up, and we'll notify you all by email or by message, through social media, in multiple ways whenever we do that. So just keep that in mind. I want to announce our next speaker, Mike Tully. He is the president and CEO of Aerial Services Incorporated, located in the heartland of Iowa. He is a certified photogrammetrist and GIS professional. He holds MS in forestry and a master's in business administration. Mike has been leading this company and writing about the remote sensing and mapping profession for 2 decades. He's a technologist, innovator, and thinker, and is the head of getting right things done well at Aerial Services. Please welcome Mike. Thank
you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me back again this year. Joe, thanks. I'm one of those photogrammetrists that's here today. How many photogrammetrists are in the audience today? I think there's just 2 of us, I know. It's a hard word to say, but thanks. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about drones and remote sensing and mapping. We've been using drones in Iowa and around the country for the last several years. They are certainly here to stay, aren't they? How many of you are using drones in your operations for any purpose? Yeah, more and more. Next year, twice as many, 3 times as many of you will be using drones for one reason or another. They are amazing technology. As amazing as they are today, 20 years from now, we'll look back and wonder how we did things with the drones we have today, because they're going to change so rapidly and are changing rapidly. We can see that with DJI, just for example. Every few months they come out with a new drone that has better technology for less money. It's just simply amazing how fast this stuff. We've been using thermal cameras for decades for specialized applications. Most people, very rarely do we use thermal cameras because the cameras themselves are very expensive and very expensive to use. But with drones, they're building drone thermal cameras that are this big and they are very inexpensive, and it just opens up a tremendous plethora of opportunities for remote sensing and mapping that we just haven't had with only manned aircraft. But as great and utilitarian as drone technology is, it's hard to discuss remote sensing and mapping today without first discussing some of the important impacts of Part 107 rules and how they impact our profitability using drones. So the 3 key things that I think impact us most out in the field when we're using drones from the regulatory perspective are these things. Beyond visual line of sight, we still cannot fly drones further than we can see them with our naked eye, which means that we can only map and remote sense small areas at a time. You've got a 1 or 2 man field crew you've got to put out in the field, and you've got to move them around to get work done. Once, maybe 5 years from now, maybe less time than that, when they allow us extended line of sight or beyond visual line of sight, that's when the technology really begins to leverage itself well and will be used for make a tremendous impact in all of our lives. But until then, until we get there, it's expensive to use a drone out in the field when you can only map a very small area that you can see with your eyes. For reasons I don't understand, the FAA allows us to fly only up to 400 feet. Manned aircraft will not fly below 1,200 feet or so. So there's a whole bunch of airspace between 0 and 1,000 feet or 1,200 feet that we could be flying drones in without impacting manned aircraft any more than we're impacting them at 400 feet. But for some reason, we can only fly at 400 feet. And in remote sensing mapping, the higher you can fly, you have lots of advantages, one of which is cost. You can map more and cheaper the higher you go. So limiting us to 400 feet is a burden, and it will be a burden upon you as you go out and try to map things. Flying over people not involved in the operation is another restriction. We're not allowed to do that. We were just flying a borrow pit that we'll talk about here in a minute, and we had to actually go get all of the employees that worked at the borrow pit to sign and say they were part of the operations, our operations, just so that we could fly over their heads and take pictures and map. So those are things that you might not think are that big a deal, but they do have an impact on your profitability and the costs of doing any mapping project out in the field. So I want to talk about some practical things when you get out there to actually start acquiring data that you run into that again will impact what you come back with and the cost of the data you're producing. I'll eventually end with slides on some work we're doing right now with the Department of Transportation on establishing accuracy of some typical systems. And it's very preliminary data, very interesting, and will hopefully help us all understand, set realistic expectations from these sensors and these aircraft. The reason I want to talk about wind first is it's a big deal. It's always there. And these drones, most of the drones are not very tolerant of wind. Wind causes that sensor, whether it's a LiDAR sensor or a camera, to toss around. And as you know, as you toss a camera around, it creates blurs. If you're trying to take pictures straight down on the ground and your camera's tilted like this, you're not going to capture that area of the ground that the camera is tilted away from. And you come back with 1,000 images of your area, and you've got holes in the coverage because your camera was tipping and tilting, that was blowing around. So you've got to understand these things, you've got to plan for them and pick your equipment and lay out your flight planning such to accommodate these unexpected, unpredictable things like wind and eliminate blur and holes in your coverage. One of the things, as a photogrammetrist, I love this word aero triangulation that most people don't know what it means, but it's basically the math and the science behind pinning photographs taken from far away together and representing something accurate on the Earth. And all of this wind affects aero triangulation, which is the heart of photogrammetry, which is the heart of accuracy of any models that you bring back, any ortho photos or digital Earth models. All of that, their accuracy is affected by the aero triangulation, by wind. Wind will cause tip and tilt. This is just a graphic that shows you in a typical flight how many of these frames were off. The crab tip or tilt because of wind was beyond the acceptable threshold, and there could be a hole in the coverage in those areas. What are you going to do about that? When you get back, you bring your crew back to the office, and you've got 5 or 6 holes in your coverage. What impact is that going to have on the production of your data? Are you going to have to send crews back out there because, oh, doggone, I got 6 holes in my coverage? Those are things you have to understand, be aware of, and plan for. Resolving power is another very important consideration when selecting the type of cameras that you're using with your aircraft. Our drones today, most of our drones have very, very inexpensive cameras. Now, years ago, we would have, a photogrammeter would have said, you can never take good pictures with a little chintzy plastic lens camera that we have in our cell phones and these drones. But today, the science has evolved, and we can make amazing three-dimensional models, digital elevation models, and imagery from chintzy cameras. It's fantastic. But you do lose some things like resolving power and wind, movement up in the aircraft, the quality of that lens, and the production of the data all affect the ultimate resolving power of the system. And the resolving power is just a measure of how well we can identify features or the smallness of features in our photography. And it can be measured, but a lot of people seem to think that just because I have high resolution orthophotography, that I'll be able to see really detailed things on the ground, but that's not true. If your system produced imagery that has low resolving power, like that guy laying on the ground there, that's like a 2 centimeter GSD ortho. I can't see a 4 or 6 centimeter hand or face because the resolving power is so low that on that high resolution imagery, I still can't make out those small features. So high resolving power is a very important consideration. Pick cameras, pick the best camera you can afford for your system that's got a good lens and is stable. We'll talk about that next. I don't know how many different systems we've used. Some have stabilized mounts, some don't. Get a system that uses a stabilized mount for all these reasons. A lot of these problems can be minimized, not eliminated, but minimized using a stabilized mount. They make a big difference and will eliminate a lot of the costs that you have at the back end producing the data that you've collected in the field. Flight planning is important because you're going to run into things like this, large features. You can see those white dots on the screen over there are the centers of all the frames that were collected. You can see the footprint for any particular frame was much, much smaller than the top of that building. So when the computer tries to take those photos from the top of that building and stitch them together, every frame has exactly the same content in it, a metal roof with no features on it. So the computer is unable to stitch those photos together. And therefore you come back from the field and you've got a big hole in your orthophoto because it was unable to stitch all of those little frames together. The way to handle that is you fly higher, to fly with more overlap, or perhaps get a camera with a different focal length. All strategies that eliminate things like that. But to not know that before you go out in the field can have a big impact, again, back in the office, where your costs are going up. This is what it looks like. You can imagine the computer trying to stitch the photo on the right with a photo on the left. There's just nothing unique. There's no unique content in the two images for it to stitch together accurately. That causes problems like this. This is just a real schematic representation of this thing called AT, arrow triangulation. Green is good, and red is bad, and blue is really nasty. And this is what the typical kind of thing you'll come back with if you're not careful. Instead of a block on the right that's all green and it's going to tie together good, and you've got good results, and the accuracy will be high of those orthos and of the digital elevation models, compared to the one on your left, where you've got that blue area, that way bad nasty area. Those are frames that it just could not tie together. There's no strong mathematics tying those frames with its neighbors. And there's nothing at this point in the office, there's nothing you can do about that other than manually trying to resolve those issues. Otherwise, you'll have holes and gaps in your products. This is just a picture of that area that produced that really hard, bad AT. It looks like just a a stream. Who knows why? I know why, but you wouldn't necessarily know why unless you looked at it for a while. But again, there are other strategies. You've got to know what strategies to use to minimize those kinds of issues. Bad AT also contributes to poor surface models or digital elevation models. And this is a typical example of what you'll see in digital elevation models that are being created from AT that's not real strong, with weak mathematics between these frames of pictures. You'll see the speckling. Well, that speckling shouldn't be there. The ground is actually flat, but it shows as speckled and undulating ground, which is not true, which again is going to lower the accuracy of your orthophoto, lowers the accuracy of the digital elevation model, and is not as desirable as being more accurate. One of the things we found at Aerial Services is that, and I'll have a couple graphs here later, that shows that the acquisition is a far smaller cost than the data processing. The data processing from drone data, where you've got hundreds if not thousands, gigabytes, sometimes approaching hundreds of gigabytes of data. Data processing back in the office is by far the most time-consuming and the most costly aspect of a drone mapping project. Like I said, we just got done collecting information from a borrow pit in western Iowa. It was about 365 acres. We had to mobilize crews from our offices, which was about 464 miles round trip. So those are, think money, think expenses. You've got two guys in a pickup truck going 500 miles. Just to give you an example, for 365 acres with a typical battery-operated drone, it took about 7 flights or 7 batteries to collect 365 acres. It took several days to do what we were doing, but for any particular drone, it might take 3/4 of a day to collect 365 acres. Now that's interesting. You've got two guys on the ground. They drove 500 miles to get there, and it took them half a day or so to collect that site. In a manned aircraft, I could collect half the state of Iowa in a half a day, right? So that shows you some level of efficiency between a manned and an unmanned aircraft that you have to consider when you're planning or think about mapping something with the drones, because it's not always the most cost-effective tool for the job. On this site, the DOT wanted us to help them define just how accurate typical drone systems, both cameras, drones, and LiDAR drones were today, and then to use that information to help them establish their internal guidelines for using this technology for DOT projects. And so we designed a project where we used the DJI Inspire 2 camera drone. We flew all of these drones at 200 feet and at 400 feet above ground. We used the Altavian fixed wing camera system. So we had both the virtual takeoff and landing and the fixed wing camera system, drone system. Then we also used the Pulse Aerospace single rotor helicopter with a very high-end LiDAR system, the Regal VUX LiDAR. And then we compared all that with a manned aircraft using a very good metric camera, a camera with a very good lens, a well-defined lens, and a high-end $750,000 LiDAR system. That was kind of, so the manned aircraft was kind of the base. Here's as good as we could expect. And we're comparing that to these three other drone systems at both the high and the low altitude. So we wanted to see just what the accuracies were. In that area, we laid out 25 targeted ground control points. So in our world, that's a very well-controlled, highly controlled area, so we should be able to test accuracy very accurately. And then we used about 75 checkpoints, both horizontal and vertical checkpoints, all situated within the 3 different types of cover areas: hard surfaces, bare earth, and vegetation. So again, it was over-controlled. Nobody had ever paid money to control this heavily, but it was overly controlled so we could really test the accuracy of the stuff. Qasim, what's Qasim's last name? Qasim Abdullah at Wolpert just published a paper here in April that indicated that their drone tests with a single drone, they were getting, in a well-controlled mapping test, they were getting about 6 to 7 centimeter accuracy horizontally and about 8 to 10 centimeters vertically. Our results so far, they're very preliminary. I haven't got much of the data analyzed yet. But we used, not only do we have all that control, but we also tested 3 different control configurations, because the more control you have, the better you can test the accuracy of your data set. But it's expensive. So our job as photogrammetrists is to figure out how to fly and map something with the least possible control, because control is so expensive. So we used 3 configurations. We used all 25 points. We used just 8, which in a typical block flight you might only need 5. But this was not an orthogonal or a rectangular block. It was an unusual shape, so we needed 8. And we used no control. And what's interesting, and this concurs with Qasim's results, was that you don't get a whole lot of a value using more than that minimal control, about 5 or 8 points. We were getting about the same accuracy as using all 25 points. So that's good news. We can control these drones and measure accuracy and get good accuracy using a minimal control configuration. It's interesting to note that too, when you use no control, look at the difference. A lot of people using drones today don't understand the purpose of ground control. And the manufacturers will tell you their drones can map within 5 centimeters or 2 centimeters. Commonly you hear that. Well, that's all theoretically true. But if they don't have control, any way of controlling that data set, this is the real results you'll get, is 5 or 6 feet off in horizontal. So our results so far are about twice as, or half as accurate as Qasim noticed with their 1 drone system. But we're using multiple drone systems, and these are preliminary, so these may change. So it just gives us some idea of what to expect with your drones as you're talking to your companies and stakeholders about what you can expect from drones. This is just some data that is filling in those blanks that we don't know yet, and will be helpful in that way. Here's a couple graphs I wanted to just quickly show you. This is the costs at different AGLs, altitudes, and this is at 40 meters, flying at 90 meters, and flying at 122 meters, and you see the costs. The thing I want you to note here is the processing costs. Notice that the processing costs, for the lower you go, the processing costs go up fast because of the amount of data, the number of photos, the density of LiDAR that you're collecting. As a proportion to the total cost of the projects, just notice that the green is always a huge percent of the cost of any drone mapping project. So if you think it's expensive to send your truck and your crews out to the field, think again, because it's when they get back that the costs really go through the roof. That's all I have for today. I'm happy to answer any questions. Please check out our free ebooks about drones and some articles on our website, if that would be helpful to you. I can answer any questions you might have. Yes, sir. Eric?
Those are on-site targets, the control you're talking about?
Yes, on-site targets, yep. All surveyed into, hundreds.
Do you have vertical accuracies in that test as well?
I didn't have them on that slide because we haven't got that far, but we will have. We'll have horizontal and vertical for all of those platforms at different altitudes. We're very keen to learn just how much accuracy you lose flying from 200 to 400 feet. Any other questions?
Mike,
Yes.
once the studies are completed, how, is that going to be compiled into a white paper, and who's going to have publishing rights on that?
We're going to see if ASPRS will publish this paper for us, and hopefully this fall sometime it'll come out in press. Anything else? Yes, sir.
What software are you using to process?
Good question. It makes a difference. I didn't have any slides on the software. The most common software is Pix4D. It comes bundled with a lot of these systems, and it's a good piece of software. It makes it all easy. It takes photogrammetry that's really hard to say, let alone do, and makes it really easy. Push a button, out comes everything. The problem with that is it doesn't give you any flexibility. And a photogrammeter, somebody that understands accuracy, I want to manage my sources of error, because every measurement has error. The camera introduces error, the GPS receiver, the GPS chip introduces error, the INS, the initial navigation system, introduces error. And I want to be able to push that error around and manage it. And Pix4D doesn't do that. SimActive is another package that we use. SimActive allows you much more flexibility. They're both good. They both produce decent products, but they take a long time. Yep. Questions? Any more? All right. Thank you all.